Hey guys, it's Peter Jordan from Lost Angler here at Delta Marine and Outfitters, and we're talking to Captain Dan Kolenich, and he's going to get through and try to tell us about his tactics for fall fishing right now. Now, Dan, you've been guiding out here about a week now, right?
Yeah, plus 24 years.
So about a
Yeah,
week, yeah.
couple of weeks.
Okay. So anyway, Dan's forgotten more about fishing Mobile Bay than I'll ever know, and he's been nice enough to come out here and tell us a little bit about what's going on, his fishing experience, and what we can do as anglers right now, whether we're spin fishing or we're fly fishing. So Dan, I'm gonna get out of your way.
Thanks, Peter.
No problem.
Well, I'm glad to be able to talk to you for a little while this afternoon. And like Peter said, I've been guiding for 24 years down here. Fished here a little longer before I started guiding full time from the 90s. And when I first showed up in early 90, it was all new to me. I didn't know what the heck I was doing or where I was going. So what I'd like to do today is share a little bit of what I've learned down here, a little bit of what I do. It may not be the right way. It may not be the way you do it, but it's something that I've found over the years works quite well for me. So with that, we're talking about the Mobile Tensaw Delta, which is located within a couple miles south of Interstate 10 and 4 or 5 miles north of Interstate 10. It's about an 8 mile long stretch with 5 rivers that run through it, lots of grass flats. And what we have is by summertime every year, the salt water has moved its way in and up into the delta by June. The water's still a little bit of muddy from water coming down the rivers. We happen to have just short of 20% of all the water that flows out of fresh water into salt water come through Mobile Bay. So that's quite a volume of water that flows year long through the bay that fights the salt water. And it's real easy to understand. Salt water's heavier. It doesn't mix with fresh water very readily. The fresh water that comes down the rivers is generally muddy. The salt water that comes in from the Gulf is generally crystal clear. So what we have is sometime during June and July, the grass flats in the bays in the Causeway turn clear. And that's very dependent on how much rainfall we get. Nonetheless, with a lot of rainfall, we'll still end up with clear water by August going into September. And if we look at the weather map, you'll see that it's the weather here in June through September is like the 2 worst weeks of summer you have anywhere in the country. It's hot, very hot, and the water gets hot. We'll have surface temperatures in the bay and on the grass flats in excess of 90 degrees, which is good and bad. Redfish, on one hand, don't seem to mind the high temperatures. They prefer high salinity, but they will tolerate some brackish water. Matter of fact, we even joke you can raise a redfish in your bathtub if you change the water slow enough. Speckled trout, on the other hand, they're very sensitive to the salinity. So they're not going to move into the bay while the water's still brackish to freshish. They will come into brackish to salt water. They also prefer water in the 70-degree range. And by that I mean from 70 to 80 degrees. So they're constantly seeking water in that temperature because that's the temperature they need in order to be able to reproduce. And speckled trout are capable of spawning 24 or 12 months out of the year if they're in 70-degree water. So they kind of start to get lethargic and head deep once the 4th of July hits and the water starts to get real warm. Again, in September is the last of our hot weather, so the water just doesn't get any hotter in September. It doesn't start to cool until October, which is when the speckled trout start to come out and become active. So October through December, while the water's still salty, we've got a really good fishery for speckled trout. For redfish, we've got a really good fishery all summer long. Once the salt water comes in and the bait they like to eat, the shrimp, the crabs, move into the areas, and they, as a general rule, redfish until they're 26 inches long become resident fish. They'll stay in the same area as long as they have plenty of food to eat. So the fish that come into the bay will come into the bay, stay in the bay until the water turns too fresh for them, at which time they'll run out towards the Gulf, but just stay close by, ready to come back in the next year. Or may go to Orange Beach, may go up the Mississippi Sound, other areas where the water can stay salty. Some of our rivers also, to get away from the Causeway, some of our rivers like Fish River, Magnolia River, Dog River, they've got some deep spots in them that'll hold salt water all winter long. So those fish will migrate into those places, as well as the shrimp stay there all through the winter while the bay turns fresh. But the key to remember is that when you see the muddy water in the bay, that's a fresh water, and you want to try to avoid it. Avoiding it doesn't mean going away from it, because as we get closer to summer and as we enter into winter, the fresh water is lighter. It may stay on top, and 2 feet down the water may be salty. So you want to, as the water's changing colors, you want to be looking a little bit deeper, a little bit slower. The water would tendency to be a little bit cooler to find those fish. Another fun fact, speckled trout generally grow to be 14 inches in their first year, where redfish will grow 16 inches in their first year. So both fish grow pretty fast. And so they eat quite a bit. They're not necessarily difficult to fish. It's a matter of what I like to call thinking like a bait. Their only job as a fish is to find bait. So what they are is they're constantly looking for bait. So if you think like bait, you're going to look around points. You're going to look up in the grass where it's an easy place to hide. You're going to look around oyster shells, which you can get down in the nooks and crannies. And those are the kind of places you want to look for them to fish. What I do, I fished the redfish tour for a number of years, and what I find that I like to do is get a hold of a chart of an area, rather than a nautical looking chart like this. I prefer to photographic charts. And with that, you can see where the bars hang down off the points, which this one doesn't show, but this is just something to get around in the Causeway with.
So for folks that are getting into it, would like Google Earth be really helpful to them?
Outstanding. And that is outstanding, but it's hard to bring it with you. Unless you got, well, now with 5Gs, the world sure is changing, isn't it? I remember in 2004 when I fished the redfish tour, we'd certainly have to buy a photographic plastic laminated chart, and we'd just bring a mark slot with us and we'd draw on it and change it and mark where we were, just so we could make sure we found our way back home sometimes. But yeah, that works real well. Another thing I'd like to talk about is what I try to use for gear to fish the fish. I don't fish with live bait a lot, although, you know, it's hard to say. Fishing with fish food to catch fish works quite well. So there's nothing like a live shrimp. You can fish a live shrimp on a popping cork or fish a live shrimp on a Carolina rig. On the other hand, I do a lot of fly fishing. About 80% of my business is fly fishing. And with that, you've got two disadvantages. One, you've got the weight and the diameter of the fly line fighting the current. But on an advantage side, you've got a fly that you can adjust the weight on by tying heavier, lighter flies to set its place in the water column. So when I'm fishing shallow grass flats, I use extremely light flies. I can move it a lot slower than I can move any lure because it doesn't sink. On the other hand, when I'm fishing the banks of the rivers, you've got the river current flowing in or out depending on what the tide's doing, but you've also got that current pulling or pushing the line in a certain direction and dragging your fly along with it. So you've got to keep those items into consideration. Again, when you're fishing the banks of the rivers, you can use a heavier fly, start out in a couple feet of water and work it right on off the drop-off into 5, 8, 10 feet of water. And certainly if you'd want to fish any water deeper than 6 feet, primarily, you'd want to use a sinking fly line that helps drag that fly to the bottom. But a fly can quite adequately be fished just like any jig or any other lure you would use. Now to take a look at, oh yeah, back up a second here. If I'm going to fish with a fly, I'm going to go ahead and fish with an 8-weight fly rod for 99% of my catches. Here we don't catch too many redfish that are over 26 inches, and the trout are usually under 22, 24 inches. So you've got plenty of rod to fight the fish. You've got enough backbone in the rod to cast into the wind and get to where you want to go. If we're fishing with conventional tackle, I have two rigs here. One is a bait caster, and what I prefer to use fishing shallow water is a spinnerbait. I love a spinnerbait for one main reason, well, several actually, but the one main reason is that the faster you reel it, the shallower it'll run, so you can control the depth. If there's only 6 inches of water above the grass or an oyster bed, you can reel it faster. If there's 3 feet of water above the oyster bed or the grass flat, you can reel it a lot slower. If you're fishing an area that doesn't have any snags that you have to worry about, you can actually let it drop to the bottom and work it like a spoon. I prefer braided line, 10-pound range for all of my personal fishing. I prefer it because it doesn't stretch, and I have a lot more feel of what the bottom's doing and what the lure's doing and what the bite's doing. For some reason, I like to fish a spinnerbait on a bait casting reel. I prefer a rod that's got a medium action, somewhere in the 7-foot length. I've latched on to a Falcon rod that is 6'10", that I find to be quite adequate. The second thing I use a lot of are what we call jigs. It's simply a weighted jig head with a soft plastic, and I'll generally fish these and crankbaits with a spinning reel. Again, we're talking about 10-pound test line, 6'8" rod, medium action. You get quite a good casting distance with the spinning rod over the bait casting rod, is why I go to the other baits other than spinners with that. I'll use a somewhere between 1 foot and 2 feet of leader. On top of that, generally a 17-pound fluorocarbon. I stay with the 17 just because it's a lot easier not to tie than the 20. I've caught 25-pound reds on 17-pound test and never worried about them biting through the leader. 12-pound test, I'd start to get a little nervous about it. 8-pound test, you might as well just kiss it goodbye. So I've really found a good friend in 17-pound leaders. Let's see what we have in here. Aside from choices of lures, flies, really our fish are quite naive here, so I tend to use a lot of Clouser minnows. I like to tie a minnow a little different than most people. I do tie all my flies. I tie them with a full length of bucktail. And I get that because I learned how to fish the Causeway fishing with live shrimp. In most live shrimp, everybody that goes to buy live shrimp to fish with, you hope the lady at the bait shop picks out the big shrimp for you. So why would I want to use a fly that's 2 inches or an inch shorter than this? So I want to have a good, healthy meal for a fish. So I'm just going to, and you're buying the bucktail anyway, so I'm going to use the full length of bucktail. This happens to have some small, medium weight lead eyes on it. So I'll change that weight depending on the depth of the water. There's tons of flies out there. You can kill yourself buying crab patterns, shrimp patterns. But between you and me, redfish don't really have good eyesight. So I don't know that they can't tell the difference between a Clouser minnow and a good crab. One thing I like to do is I'm a big keeper of Ziplocs. I'll have pieces of leader material, and I'll mark on the bag the weight and the type of line it is, and I'll clip off my 18 inches or so and put about 10 or 12 pieces in those bags. the same way I'll make up my own leaders. We don't have a lot of weed problem here, so I don't worry about the knots in the leaders to use a tapered leader. So these are 6 foot, 40, 30, 35, 30, 25 liters, and then I'll clip a 17-pound test on the end to make it longer than 6 feet. But these are real handy. When you're fishing, you don't need to be messing around trying to tie leaders. A couple other goodies I keep in my bag here. You always want to have a good pair of pliers for hook removal, from whether it's from you or the fish. It does happen sometimes. I keep a pair of clippers. This old pair broke, but you can still push it together and cut the line with it. So probably never lose this again. And also, I keep a sharpening stone. You spend too much time looking for fish and too much time casting and too much time trying to fool a fish that your artificial lure is real shrimp or a real fish. So why waste it with a dull hook? Just take your finger every time you pick up the hook, hook it with your finger. If it doesn't feel like it could cut you, it's too dull. A lot of people use a deal where they hang it on their fingernail to see if they can hang it into their fingernail and it's sharp enough. Either way, sharpen your hooks. And that's about all I've got. I would like to just say one thing though. Again, if you're taking the time to go out fishing and to get to where you want to go, there's a lot of people out fishing. There's people in kayaks, people in boats, maybe people wade fishing. But I think we all need to be courteous of everybody else. If you can cast to where somebody else is casting, you're probably too close to them. Likewise, they shouldn't be where both of you can cast towards each other and your lures come close to touching. So you don't need to get right on top of somebody. I know it's hard when they're catching fish and you think you can get in there and catch their fish, but hey, look, they were there before you. So use your head, look for some places that look just like that. You're probably going to find some more fish that'll be all yours. So with that, I'd like to thank you again.